Hello and most welcome to 1233 of the Heidegger series. And I will take up today the subject of Edward de Bono, parallel thinking. I think there is a good connection between how we think, our way of thinking, perceiving the world, versus classical physics and quantum mechanics. Classical physics is linear thinking, one step at a time. It also implies causal connections between thoughts, so that one thought leads to another one. It also implies contradictory thinking. Contradiction thinking is if something is by you seen to be wrong, the opposite is correct. And if something is correct, the opposite of correct is wrong. This is the thinking of contradiction, and that is also the classical thinking of Newton's mechanics. It is, however, not the thinking of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics does not work in that limited way. Thinking in contradiction, I would say, is not dancing with reality. Reality has many different aspects. And during the series we mentioned many of these, like the inside, outside, mind, body, far and close, and here and then. There are instances. In classical physics, there is an overdependence on choosing only one of these binary pairs. Now we discussed recently with Lee Smolin that our whole physics is based on the idea that there is no now, that there is no time at all. Time is settled from the beginning, and because of the laws and the initial conditions, time doesn't develop. It is already finished before it started, which is something called determinism. Determinism makes time completely unnecessary. It is not hard to see here that this will lead to rudimentary, simplified, stressful thinking. If you think in a linear mood and you have an idea of something horrible could happen, because of causality in thinking, the bad thing directly comes up in your thinking, and especially if you're thinking, if your perception is causality is outside of yourself, that causality is not a tool, an instrument, then of course it will make you defenseless. So there are many things, and I sternly believe that classical physics is not only an ideology, a view on life. It is how we actually think. We think linearly. We think about time as already finished somehow. Otherwise, why would we have built classical physics? 6 thinking hats is a very good example of how we can avoid a lot of those pitfalls of classical physics. 6 thinking hats means that we separate the different modes of thinking into 6 different modes, thereby avoiding the constant mixing, random mixing that is always the case in classical thinking, where we don't have different moods. This is somewhat similar to not understand the focal setting, not being able to change the frame of reference. 6 thinking hats is most definite all about being able to change your frame of reference. That is lying much closer to the perception. And if you changed your perception, you can also change other people's perception. We know by argumentation only in the words, you will not be able to change how people perceive. And we know from Libet and others that there is a very sure connection between how you perceive the world, the body for instance, and how you act. But there is little to non-connection between what has been termed in the West reflective consciousness and action. I think it's reasonable to say this shows in the direction only thinking in the terms of arguments, logic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, propositions, syllogism, and so forth is extremely limiting, and it makes a very random take of reality. It's a little bit like you walk around with a set of goggles that only take one piece at a time. I will also say that this leads to fragmentation of the individual. There are 2 tendencies that are very, very clear within psychology these days. The first one, there are an increasing number of people who feel themselves to be unreal. They have no longer any sense of their individuality. The second thing is, many people today think or feel or perceive the world to be unreal. These 2 tendencies, I'd say, are connected. They are based on the either or, and the either or in this case in the actual thinking, not in the content of the thinking, but in how we perform the thinking. Is thinking linear? I think it will necessarily lead to these results. So the 6 hats are, well, they identify different modes of thinking, Stimmung, and they are directions of thinking. It can help to put on different hats in a group or individually to make sure that the different modes of thinking doesn't get intermingled. And even more interestingly, the second aspect is give you a control over the thinking. It puts in a meta level. Why? Well, the meta level is that you decide what hat to put on. In classical physics, classical thinking, you have no choice. The thoughts will just follow each other without any directionality. There is no conscious control over them. You need tools to control them. Edward de Bono suggested that these tools could be used for problem solving, strategic planning, running meetings, creating creativity. The 6 colors are white, which is, I would say, the core of classical physics. It's neutral, it's objective, it's state of the fact. Red, it's emotional, angry. Black is serious, somber. Yellow is sunny and positive. Green is growth, fertility. Blue is cool, sky above. By having these distinctions, we will hinder the most common thing, that everything gets intermixed all the time. And we will gain a fantastic ability to shape our thinking. There is no coincidence that within classical physics there is absolute determinism, all the way to that point that time doesn't even exist. It is coming from the way we are thinking in the West. We don't have a choice in our thinking. We are doing an automatic process that doesn't have a directionality from a conscious self. This is the reason that we both feel that outside we have no to none to little control, and on the inside we have this feeling of unreality. The feeling of unreality is the same as sitting in a car that is driven from above, like a drone. Of course, you will not feel with the car, someone else is doing the driving. This process of classical physics makes us dependent, unfree, slaves to other thinkings, whatever they might be. Could be intentional, but I would say they are mostly unintentional. Here are some general hat issues. It is direction, not description. The usual move of classical physics thinking is description. Describe things the correct way, not the incorrect way, and you will get some sort of mechanical result. We know that not to be the case. We need direction, and the body needs to be in on it. Otherwise, the body will do its own work, and that means mixing objective facts with subjective states. If you don't take care of the driving of the car, you will not be driving the car intentionally. You'll be sitting there and someone else drives the car for you. I would say that that lack of control is what classical physics is. It is not general categories of people. You shouldn't say that this or that person is a black hat thinker, or everyone can or should use all the hats. All 6 should come into play. It is also a constructed form of showing off. You could show off by being a better thinker in a group, and that will give you the gratitude and reward, because intention is closely connected to reward. Classical thinking is unrewardful. It doesn't give you predictive power. Therefore, your decisions, your thinking is unthankful, as Martin Heidegger would have it, which I think is very correct. It is random, it is automaticated, it's following a pre-arranged, a priori model of the world. Therefore, never ever letting the world be something what it is. Instead, you tell it what it is. I think there is a close connection here between today's lack of focus and why ADHD, OCD, different phobias, anxieties, nervousness has become so common. When we neglect the body, we let in a random constant that is not constant into the equation of thinking. It will go left, it will go right, you will have no control whatsoever where the thinking is ending in the end. Therefore, all thinking in this narrowed way will be a sort of tensing. You will be trying to be mental. How do you become mental? Well, you close off the surrounding world and you try to make thinking inside of the head or inside of the body. This is what Richard Ealing called the reflective consciousness. It is an only insidedness of being. And it's also at the very same time establishing a very clear outsidedness of reality. That reality is truly outside. This is the start of the binary thinking in contrasts. It starts with the thinking. It is not an ideology or a philosophy of binaries. It is the actual mood of thinking. It is the Stimmung. Let me describe the different properties of thinking. White-hat thinking is neutral, objective facts. Facts and figures, questions, what do we know, what don't we know, what do we need to know, excludes opinions, hunches and judgments. It removes feelings and impressions, and it has two tiers of facts, believed facts and checked facts. So that is all contained within the white hat. And white hat is like a piece of white paper. And I think this is what, so to speak, classical physics wants to be. But since it doesn't have a control, it cannot even be one of the hats. It's going to be an interminglement that is out of control. Red hat thinking, on the other hand, are emotions and feelings, hunches, intuitions, impressions. It doesn't have to be logical or consistent. No justifications, reasons, or basis. All decisions are emotional in the end. Yellow hat thinking is positive and speculative. It is positive thinking, optimism, opportunity, benefits, best case scenarios, exploration. Green hat thinking, that's the creative hat. New ideas, concepts, perceptions. It's the deliberate creation of new ideas. Alternatives and more alternatives. It includes new approaches to problems, and it includes creative and lateral thinking. Black hat thinking is cautious and careful. I think that is a good pointer to what the black hat does. It is blackness, it's nervousness, what to look out for. It puts us on the toes, makes us suspicious, aware. It is cautious and careful. Logical negative, why something won't work. It has critical judgment and pessimistic view. It separates logical negative from emotional negative. They are not the same. Focus on errors, evidence, and conclusions. It is logical and truthful, but not necessarily fair. I think the promise of being your own Lord, your director of your thinking, is impossible with classical physics, because it doesn't provide you the tools. So it becomes an empty saying. How could you think without these tools? It's a bit like René Descartes just saying thinking, cogito ergo sum. It's not thinking if you don't have different tools. Tools like Barbara Tversky in her fantastic exploration into how doing things with our hands taught us to think. They are tools. How could you drive without the steering wheel? If you don't have hands, arms, legs, how can you walk about and do things? Being a conscious, directed being is meaning using tools. Being in the classical world is being a slave. And this is very similar to what Donald Weed was claiming in his book, You Get What You Think. It is actually the actual process of thinking that determines the result, not the content of the thinking, whatever that might be. And I think the idea of a content in thinking is preposterous, as revealed by Ludwig Wittgenstein in his philosophical investigations. By sticking into the content, we lose the reality of thinking, because thinking is real. It has real effects. It changes the world so that it can present itself. Without a priming, without that you infuse yourself with something before, you will not be able to let the reality show itself by itself. In the monoculture of the classical physical thinking, the want of pure white, it is exactly what eradicates all whiteness. It wouldn't be too much of an exaggeration to say that within the classical thinking, all hats randomly construct things by themselves, not taking any advice from the white hat. There are no distinctions in classical thinking. Everything is complete intermingle and randomness. We are not aware of the different modes, as I call it sometimes. Stimmung from Martin Heidegger, or attitude as Ian McGilchrist is proposing, especially in his latest book, The Matter of Things. The blue hat is very important because that is the one that manages the thinking. It's a bit like body in Samkhya way, and we know Indians do actually use body even if they don't have the concept. Giving it a concept can help Westerners to establish a body, build it up from scratch, and being able to perform with it. It doesn't make us mechanical, just the opposite. We need tools to be free. Tools are not an obstruction to freedom. It's the way to freedom. That is a really big blow to Rousseau, and I think I'm going to name this lecture The Death Knell of Rousseau, because all he said was in contradistinction to what I'm saying now. He preferred naturalness of the savage or the child, not intermingling, letting everything be natural, would bring about huge success in thinking. All these types of thinking are not present by birth. These are trained, they are culture devised, which is bad and which is also fantastic, because that means that you can learn them. And we also in this thinking slowly start to think that truth is a function. It is not something out there, it is not something mechanically that what I think represents something true in the world. That is a random take of reality that my thinking, my little line of thinking corresponds to something. And then we lose the ability to use the true function. It is a function within thinking and without in the world, not something automatic. Traditional thinking or classical thinking is mass finding. It tries to find data, it finds problems, it tries to find ideas, solution and acceptance. And normal classical physics is exactly like Daniel Dennett, or worse, Steven Pinker, or why not Richard Dawkins. It should be an enforced thinking. Everybody should think that way, as to make the world better. It's absurd to say that all carpenters should use the same tool at the same time. It simply doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It is actually attacking rationality, not accepting different modes. It is saying that thinking is otherworldly, and I just get a flash of inspiration, and that makes me a panopticon and a homunculus, and all of a sudden my thinking just plops out. I don't have to do anything, my thinking doesn't have a history, and all of a sudden it sounds very close to the ideas of Western thinking, because it defies its own history. It is just there. So the Greeks somehow had same tools as we did, Romans, Byzantines, conquistadors, Ethiopians, Chinese. Thinking is just there, it's toolless, springing from nowhere. And if you think about thinking as nothing or nowhere or nonsensible, it will be that. You will make it obscure. You will make like having a car and there is no mechanic on that island, you're stranded. You have a car and you say, I'm never ever going to open the hood. It is not very hard to calculate what will happen in the end. Car will stop, you will have no way of changing that. Closing the hood is what Steven Pinker, Richard Dawkins and all others wants us to do. Not see thinking as something of a tool. Could also be a certain idea that will debase thinking, making it of the flesh, making it less. Because we have this admiration for great thinking in the West, but we have no admiration for the tools. They are base, they are material, they can be learned, they are cultural, they are time dependent, they have all these traits that we don't want to see in rationality. It just plops up from nowhere. Rationality, according to these people, has a lot of its value just because it's sort of given from the skies, coming from nowhere, and the only thing we can see are the results of thinking. Logic is not thinking, it is the result of thinking. It takes time to do, it takes skill, it takes practice, and it will not be the same ever for each time you think about it. I would say classical mechanical thinking is a bit like driving with a blindfold. You can come home, but it's not certain. And every time you come home, you get so glad, and you say, it did work with blindfold. Seeing nothing helped me reach my house. And the very idea that the body is not into the thinking, so clearly defined by David Bradel, and other neurologists like Georgi Buzaki, Lisa Feldman Bartet. Thinking is a skill in the cerebellum that sort of puts everything into sync. We train our thinking, and when we lose the training, the discipline of thinking, we also lose the ability to think. And in that case, we just have the end product. And we hope somewhere in our heart that we are all sharing the same private language. What happens is that we don't reach out. Our words stop meaning for ourselves and for others. This is what classical physics is. It is not no longer being able to make sense to others or oneself. It is a self-positioned solipsism. The idea that we can divide the world and make all thinking there, and the outside is non-thinking, is also related to the idea that material is different from thinking, and that there is no close connection. We try by tensing and slouching to make thinking purely mental, just like René Descartes was walking in the floors of the castle up in Stockholm, freezing and getting sick and eventually dying. All people who are doing classical are tensing. because they have no longer any control over the body. They try to block it out. They try to block emotions, remembrances, fantasies. Everything should be blocked out. And therefore there is no development, for all these 6 hats and the parallelism is taking place in the body. This is the center of consciousness, not here in the stratosphere or nanosphere or something. We live thinking. And this is not the Rousseau thinking of the savage. It is not the thinking of the child. It is something learned, not natural, if you want. But we should abandon the distinction naturalness and artificiality. I think there's a distinction that plagued Western thinkings for millennia. And instead, as Edward Bono so greatly said, one of my big favorites, the idea of creativity in the West is often liberation. Free your mind. Free your mind from the things that limits it and expand. Take a drug, try LSD. Free your mind. How can you be free if you have no tools? How can you run around in the woods if you have not good boots? How can you manage freely a garden without the garden tools? Should you gravel just with anything, without even deciding what it is you're using, which is exactly the case when it comes to classical physical thinking. Randomness is ingrained in the whole thinking. Randomness in itself is the élan vital of classical physical thinking. Everything is completely random. And your experiences are random and tainted with negativity of defeat, lacking in predictive power. For every time you hazardously and randomly utilize your thinking capacity, the failure or the not so good result will lead you to give up slowly, give up thinking, and reduce thinking to something that is only good for crosswords, Sudoku, or worse, some sort of computer game, TikToks and other things. There are incredible differences in the world with the cultural development. I think one good scenario is Korean, Japanese children are receiving 3 to 4 times as much as verbal exchange with their parents than Western children. This is training them intensely. The reason for us not doing that is we assume thinking to be sort of inherent, inside ourselves, just coming from nowhere. Maybe that could be used as a criticism of classical physics, whereas they do establish the existence of a person as a materiality and consciousness as a sort of construct of the brain and the physical world. They never ever mentions the different modes of thinking. Those are non-things. Where does the rationality come from? Well, it just happen to be exact. And also this ridiculous binary idea of it being either true or false, nothing in between. Of course, it could be the perfect piece of art. But a perfect piece of art is relative. It's a progressive scale. If it weren't a progressive scale, what would sort of encourage the artist to make something better? What would encourage the artist to make this finger better? If everything is already out there. Don't you see how reward intention is closely connection? Without reward from thinking, doing, everything goes down. And you end up with this. It's a very good example. The water here is not carefully made. And the background, the color here, I'm not sure whether this is the original color or it faded in the sun, but it doesn't look like green. I think it could have been done better with a person who is intensely aware that you do change the world. Playing with reality becomes more real. Reality is when we play with the world, when we do things in the world. It is not something automatically God-given. This is actually our responsibility. My suggestion is, do be responsible for your own thinking. There is no need for any revolution, changing your life or changing your demeanor or eating healthy food if you don't sort of take care of your thinking. All those other things would be in vain. And I think we manage in the West to make our thinking even more automated. It's time to go away from that. It's time to listen to what Bono said, and also listen to what we learn now, the last decade or two from neurology, that thinking is a tool, it's an active process. And ignoring that, you can't have any predictive power. That's something you train. And in the end, you will just give up and say it was already determined from the beginning. You see the connection here, why we had this ridiculous idea of time as already being determined from the beginning, which is no time. You see how everything hooks into each other to make a lockdown of reality, which is a lockdown of the body. This is the Western body of defeat. This is classical Stimmung, mode, attitude. Go out of that and do that both mentally, because you need to widen your thinking. Maybe the worst kick blow I will present today is to say that Western thinking by supposing logic from the beginning, which is an absurd, I don't want to get too negative here or too accurate, but it's absurd. How can logic be thinking? It is something we produce. But by assuming contradictions from the beginning, we will not be able to present contradictions when they are due, when we need to make a distinction in the painting or in reality, or put our foot down and say, I did not think the Third Reich was any good. We lose that ability. We misuse the tool of contradictions, and therefore having no access to contradictions. Having no access to direction, we become passive. We become spectators of our own life, not participating. Because participating takes that you see differences beyond 1 and 0 or more complicated. course you can say that it's a perfect painting, the best one ever made. But it's built up from those small steps of either a little better or a little worse. And so goes for thinking. And by finding out when it's better and worse, you learn also how to make it better. But if everything just goes in this direction, both the world and the inner becomes blank, unknown, something you can't perceive or influence. So that makes human will less, in my take today in this lecture, less mysterious, because it's just more or less being able to use all the 6 thinking hats and more. Because when you have the tools, you know how to use them, you can have freedom of thinking. But you can have no freedom of thinking if you are classically inclined. And it's not enough to be, it's a start to be giving up classical physics, but it's not enough. You need to train yourself. You need to learn what balance is. And I think this is also obvious in many of the Alexander books. It's assumed that the child has a perfect posture. What nonsensical. I was the firm believer of that as well. But everything can be bettered or worsened. And that means for movement. Sometimes children move in absolute wondrous way. But the next time they do disastrous things to themselves. It's not inherent like Rousseau thought. And I would say it's a very Western way of thinking. Because once we give up that thinking can be controlled, we go to these myths. Those myths takes over and they become what creates our thinking of the world. Richard Dawkins never explained thinking, qualities of thinking, he just thinks right out. He's not aware that for his whole project to hold, a stable observer has to be placed somewhere in empty space at the constant level and direction. He is not aware the reference frame, and therefore it's less of him in every take. And this I won't go into too much. It's the Western concept of self. And not changing the reference frame makes less of an individual. The more we take in, the more we become, and that takes practice. Skillful, insightful practice. Okay, I think I round up there, but I will get back to the self soon. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon.